Hi, I'm Jim DeCola, Master Luthier for Gibson Guitars. In this episode, I'd like to discuss the Floyd Rose Tremolo system. We use the Floyd Rose at Gibson Guitars on many artist models as well as many limited run models. In addition to the Gibson models that use the Floyd Rose, many of our Epiphone brand instruments use it, as well as our Kramer brand instruments. Here I'd like to demystify and explain a lot of the features and benefits of the Floyd Rose Tremolo system. It's a double locking tremolo system, so that means it locks the strings down at the headstock at the nut, so it has a locking nut, and it also locks the bridge at the saddle. So you clip the strings, insert them in the saddle, and lock it down there. That minimizes any potential string movement which causes tuning instability. The Floyd Rose also has fine tuners for each string, so you can individually fine tune each string once they're locked down at the nut. And you'll find, once properly set up and tuned, it'll be more stable and hold tuning better than many other non-locking vibratos and tremolo systems. So to get started tuning the Floyd Rose system, I'm going to use one of the Snark clip-on tuners. And I'm going to check tuning to see where we're at now. I'll use the fine tuners. And a lot of times you'll find that you have enough room with the fine tuners, and that's all you have to do is just use your fine tuners to tune the guitar. And because it's a floating system, if you start out on your low E and move to the high E, by the time you're done, you'll have to backtrack and go through that same process a few times to allow that vibrato to balance out. Because the string tension versus the spring tension of the tremolo system has to equalize and balance. So it takes a few times and a few run-throughs in the tuning. You'll find that if you start at the low E, by the time you get to the high E and recheck the low, it'll be a little bit flat as it equalizes. Okay, now we're in tune, but there's a few other things I'd like to point out. When you're setting up the Floyd Rose Tremolo, I recommend holding it in a playing position. A lot of times, players will put their guitar on the workbench to work on them, and that's fine. But in the case of a Floyd Rose, if it's floating, some of them are set up to float, which means it can go up and down in pitch. And if so, I recommend holding it in that playing position, because if you lay it down, the gravity will cause that tremolo system to lay down, affecting your pitch. Another thing I'd like to point out is watch the fine tuners. You can see here, the high E has a bit more travel than the rest, so we're approaching the end of the tuning to pull the strings sharp. So I'll show you now how to correct that. It'll work fine now, but if you want to get more room, I'll show you how to recenter that. First, we'll use the 3mm hex wrench, and we'll loosen that locking nut on each pair of strings. It doesn't have to be super loose. I like to loosen it with the wrench and then just kind of finger tight it so it doesn't get too loose and fall off. Now, we're going to take these fine tuner screws, and you can see how long that screw is. I'm going to back out that low E all the way. And that's going to show you how much room you have here for adjustment. And they peen that screw, which means they crimp the last thread so it doesn't come all the way out so you don't lose it. So that's how much room you have. Now I'm going to readjust that in the middle of that travel. So right about there. And if anything, I'm going to err a little bit high, because as the strings stretch and settle, that'll require the fine tuner to be tightened. And now I'm going to take all those other strings and adjust them to that same level so they're all even with the travel on the low E. Now that I have them adjusted level, now we're ready to lock it down at the locking nut again. Before we lock that nut down, we're going to want to go through the tuning again and ensure that the guitar's in tune before we lock it down. And you'll have to go through it a few times as it equalizes and balances out. Now we can lock it down. Again, 3mm hex wrench. We'll lock it down snug, but you don't have to put too much force on it. Okay? Now we'll look at the fine tuning again. You have a string retainer bar up here that puts pressure on the strings as it exits the lock nut. That helps it retain its tuning stability once you lock it down. If that comes out of adjustment, you'll just need to lower that so that angle on the back of the nut is in direct contact with the strings. Now we're in tune. Now it's good to go. When the Floyd Rose is properly tuned and set up, you'll see the base plate of the tremolo will be parallel with the face of the body. If you change string gauges or tuning and the pitch changes, you'll have to readjust that. If you put a heavier set of strings on, the tremolo will typically lean forward. If you put a lighter set of strings on or tune down a half a step, it'll typically pull back. So to rebalance out the tremolo, you'll have to readjust the tremolo trim claw screws. So to do that, you'll need a Phillips screwdriver. And at Kramer, we have added these slots to the tremolo cover, so now you don't even have to remove it. So if the tremolo system is pulling back towards the body surface, you'll need to loosen the tremolo claw screws. So give it one turn, retune, and then check how it balances out. And you may have to go through it a time or two until it equalizes. If it's the other way and it's leaning too far forward, you'll want to retune after you tighten it, give it about one turn again, retune and repeat as needed. Now we're going to discuss intonating the Floyd Rose. We've already done an in-depth intonation episode, but what's different on the Floyd Rose is the actual turning of the wrenches to accomplish that. So Floyd Rose being double locking is a little bit trickier. So for that, I recommend loosening the lock nut because you're going to have to go through that retuning once you move the saddles. So when you check the intonation, you go through the same process as before where you compare the harmonic to the fretted note. Go through that. If you find that the saddle needs to move forward, again, it's the same direction as you would intonate any other guitar, so you would have to flatten that saddle. In the case of the Floyd Rose, it's not a simple matter of turning a screw. You have a 2.5 millimeter hex wrench on the front end of each saddle. So I recommend loosening the corresponding string a little bit to reduce that tension, and then very carefully, I'll hold on to that fine tuner and I'll loosen that hex screw very slightly and allow that saddle to move forward and then lock it down again. Once I do that, then I'll retune, get it to pitch, and then verify the intonation again. If it's too sharp, you'll need to move it back. So again, loosen that string to allow movement, unlock that saddle, and pull it back. And a helpful tip is if you look close in that saddle, you'll see the slots. And before and after you adjust that, get a visual on how much gap you have in that slot, and you'll have a good reference point on how much to move back. There's also three screw holes, so you can move that intonation hex screw if needed. If you don't have enough travel, you can backtrack and move it into another hole. One last thing I'll mention with the intonation, there's also aftermarket tools you can buy that kind of help facilitate that. So they kind of sit under the bridge and kind of hold on to that string clamp screw as I discussed. It makes it a little bit easier, but you'll find you can get away without it. However, that does make it easier. After all the intonation is done for all the strings, then you can go back, lock the nut down, and repeat the retuning process. Now we'll restring the Floyd Rose. As we ship the Floyd Rose from the factory, you can see the strings are clipped normal, they're clamped into the bridge. To restring it, we'll need to unlock the strings at the lock nut. And then I recommend having, here's a product called a trem lock. You can also use a rag. What this does it sits behind the bridge, so when you remove the strings, the spring doesn't pull that Floyd Rose off of the body or cause it to fall out of position, possibly scratching your guitar. If you don't have one of these devices, you can also just take a rag or a polishing cloth and double it up so it's kind of thick and substantial and slide it under the back end of that Floyd Rose. That'll just protect the body. So we'll have our lock nut loosened, and then I recommend loosening the tension on your strings, and then that will cause that Floyd Rose tremolo to kind of ease back onto that trem stop or the rag you have, and then we're going to loosen the strings up on the bridge itself. Using that 3mm hex, loosen each of the corresponding string lock screws, and you only have to give it a few turns. And then you pull that string out, and then go through all the motions one by one. You'll find you might even be able to get away with a half of a turn. And one little thing I'm going to point out here, there's a little block that goes inside that saddle that acts as kind of a vise. So when that bolt presses on that block, that's what clamps the string into place. So to remove that block, I'm going to use an X-Acto knife and just kind of pull it out. You can carefully tip the guitar up and let it fall out. But here's what you want to look for. On that block, there's a little hole on one side, and that corresponds with that string lock bolt, and it wants to sit inside that hole. That holds it in securely. So if you don't undo those string lock bolts unnecessarily too much, that block will stay in there and it won't fall out. If you do it too much, it can fall out. So if it does, and it kind of happens to everybody, just make sure that block is placed into position with that hole facing the back end, with the hole going to the deep end of that slot. That way that screw will press into that hole. And then give it a few turns, finger tight it all the way, and then back it out a few turns to allow that string to slide back in there. Now we have all the strings removed from the bridge. We'll go ahead and remove them from the headstock. And again, you may have to loosen the lock nuts a few more turns with your finger. I like to keep the clamps on the lock nut. You don't have to, but to me it's just the safer way to keep things from getting lost. Now that the strings are removed, I want to show you what to look for on the string lock block in case it does fall off or you take it off and forget how to put it back on. There is a direction, and it's kind of difficult to see, but on the bottom there's a radius on the inside going in one direction, and that corresponds with the radius inside the lock nut. There's also a little crest to that part, and that crest is also a good indicator on what direction that string lock block will face. So that crest will fall in line with the string direction. As long as you keep it in that orientation, that radius will correspond on the lock block and on the lock nut. Since I already have this removed, and for clarity, I'm going to go ahead and remove the other lock blocks. And now we're going to go ahead and install the strings. And now here's a little trick that I like to do. When I install the strings, typically you'll clip the ball end of the string off on a Floyd Rose, install it in the bridge, and then pull it through the nut onto the tuner and wind it as you would normally on a guitar. With the Floyd Rose, I found I like to insert the strings backwards, so you only clamp them once, and that's at the bridge. So I will adjust the tuners so the hole is going in line with the strings. It just makes it a little bit cleaner and easier. And now I'll insert the strings through the tuner so the ball end holds it at the tuner. And I'll do that with all 6 strings. Another little trick, as the strings go through the retainer bar, Sometimes I'll bend it up a little bit so it can slide up under there a little bit easier. Once the strings are in the tuners and past the nut, now you can go ahead and reinstall those blocks, but just finger tighten them. And that'll help those strings stay in position in the lock nut. Now here's the part where it's really beneficial. Pull all of the strings taut, make sure they're all even, and you can clip them all at once. So hold the strings until they're approximately even with the fine tuners, and you can clip them all at once that same distance, right? Now you'll go ahead one by one and put them in the corresponding saddle and lock it down. So here, you want to lock it down securely, but you don't need to overdo it. And I find, as I'm doing now, I'll kind of hold that arm and lift that back end up slightly as I'm doing that. Gives me a little bit more access. Now, with the drum stock or the rag in place to protect it, we'll go ahead and bring the tension up on all the strings. And with this method, you'll automatically have the right amount of string wrapped around that post. And as you wrap it, you want to make sure, just like we talked about in the other string winding episode, make sure that the wraps lay orderly and that they leave from the bottom of the post and not overlap on each other. Once the tension is brought back up, you can feel that it's in approximate tuning. You can go ahead and remove that rag or block, and then you can retune it, lock it down, fine tune it as you normally would. Thanks for watching. Please be sure to check out the next episode of Gibson's Guide to Guitar Setup and Maintenance.